That was the moment I realized he had no idea who he had just fired. I was standing at the end of the marble-floored branch lobby, my access badge already deactivated, the soft red light blinking like a quiet verdict. Customers sat in their chairs pretending not to stare. The security guard avoided my eyes. And my manager, Daniel, stood behind the glass partition of his office with a smile that wasn't relief, but triumph. "Clear your desk," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "And leave the building immediately." I nodded. Calm, polite, I even thanked him. What Daniel didn't know, what made that moment almost surreal, was that the lease for this entire building, from the underground parking to the executive floor he thought made him untouchable, was signed under a holding company I controlled. But I didn't say a word. Not yet. I picked up my box, walked past the teller line I had worked for 3 years, and pushed through the revolving doors into the afternoon sun. And as they spun behind me, I promised myself one thing: I would let him finish destroying himself. When I first joined the bank, I was invisible by design. Entry-level teller, neutral clothes, soft voice. I wanted it that way. After selling my fintech stake years earlier, I didn't need money, I needed perspective. I wanted to understand how power behaved when it thought it wasn't being watched. The branch was immaculate. Glass walls, polished steel. A constant hum of printers and whispered conversations. Daniel ran it like a kingdom. Mid-40s, tailored suits. MBA he mentioned at least once a week. He believed respect was something you extracted from people, not earned. The first week, he corrected me in front of customers for things I hadn't done. The second, he started assigning me closing shifts without notice. By the third, he stopped using my name. "Teller," he'd say, snapping his fingers lightly, like he was summoning a waiter. I noticed everything. The way he smiled only when regional directors visited. How his tone changed depending on job title. How he never yelled, but humiliated carefully, surgically. It was never enough to complain about. That was his genius. Once, during a staff meeting, he held up a minor cash discrepancy, already resolved, and said, "This is what happens when we hire people who look capable instead of people who are." Everyone laughed nervously. I did too. On the outside. On the inside, I noted the date, the witnesses, the camera angle. I didn't stop him because I needed him confident. The mistake Daniel made wasn't firing me. It was assuming I was desperate, assuming that the silence meant submission, assuming that because I stood behind a counter, I belonged there. The day before my termination, he called me into his office. Glass walls, door open, power move. "I don't think you're a cultural fit," he said, leaning back. "And honestly, this isn't the place for people without ambition." I looked at him and smiled. "I understand." That surprised him. He expected pleading, anger, tears. Instead, he waved me off. "HR will finalize it." That's when he made the mistake that ended everything. Because the email he sent to HR, copied to regional management, contained one line that violated not just policy, but the lease agreement he had never bothered to read. And I owned that agreement. But first, I needed him to feel safe, so I packed my box and walked out quietly, because real power doesn't announce itself, it waits. The funny thing about silence is that people mistake it for weakness. The day after I left, Daniel sent a branch-wide email. I heard about it from a former coworker who still trusted me enough to text. The subject line was something like staffing update. Professional. Clean. The body, however, was sharp. "Due to performance inconsistencies," it read, "we've decided to part ways with a teller who failed to meet our operational standards. This reinforces our commitment to excellence." No name, but everyone knew. I imagined him hitting send, satisfied, believing he had closed a chapter. Believing the story ended with me carrying a cardboard box through the lobby. What he didn't know was that I spent that evening at my dining table, laptop open, reviewing documents I hadn't looked at in years. PDFs with my signature. Legal language dense enough to bore most people into skipping the important parts. But I never skipped. Years earlier, when I was still building my portfolio, I had invested in a small real estate holding company. Boring assets, stable returns. One of those assets happened to be a commercial building leased long-term to a national bank. Triple net lease. Strict clauses. Very strict clauses about conduct, reputation risk, and management behavior. At the time, it was just another line in a spreadsheet. Until it was. Daniel's email, careless, arrogant, had created a paper trail, public internal defamation, policy breach, and more importantly, a trigger clause under operational integrity and leadership conduct. I didn't smile when I realized it. I exhaled. Because now this wasn't personal. It was procedural. The next morning, I didn't contact the bank. I contacted my attorney. She listened quietly as I forwarded the documents. No drama, no emotion. "Do you want to proceed formally?" she asked. "Yes," I said, "but not aggressively. I want them comfortable." We sent a notice, polite, neutral, addressed to corporate facilities management, not the branch. It referenced concerns about lease compliance, requested a routine leadership audit, and asked for a meeting within 10 business days. 10 days. That window was important. Because inside that time, Daniel was still walking through the building like it belonged to him, still holding meetings in the glass office, still correcting people mid-sentence, still confident. I heard he'd told someone, "She won't last long out there. People like that never do." I let him have that belief. Every few days I got updates. Corporate had acknowledged the notice. Legal was reviewing. Facilities was looped in. HR flagged the email. Slow gears, heavy wheels. Then came the call. Regional management wanted to meet. In person. At the branch, I agreed, but I didn't tell them who I was yet. I attended as a representative of the holding company. The morning of the meeting, I arrived early, different entrance. Different posture, same building. Daniel didn't recognize me at first. He was mid-sentence, joking with a regional director about keeping standards high. Then he saw me. The pause was subtle, a half-second too long. "Can I help you?" he asked. I smiled politely. "I believe we're here about the lease." His expression shifted, not fear, not yet, but irritation, the kind reserved for interruptions. "That's handled upstairs," he said. "You'll want facilities." "I am facilities," I replied, still calm. That was the first crack, not dramatic, not loud, just enough to let the doubt in. And once doubt enters, confidence collapses quickly. I took a seat at the conference table, opened my folder, laid the documents out neatly, and watched Daniel realize for the first time that this meeting wasn't about me. It was about him. The room felt smaller once everyone sat down. Glass walls, neutral gray chairs, the low hum of the building's HVAC system, things I'd heard 1,000 times from behind the teller counter, now suddenly louder. Daniel sat across from me, shoulders squared, trying to project authority. But his eyes kept flicking to the regional director, as if waiting for reassurance. He didn't get it. I introduced myself carefully, not with my full story, just enough. "I represent the ownership group responsible for this property," I said, sliding my card across the table. "We've been reviewing compliance matters related to the lease." Daniel picked up the card, glanced at it, then looked up again. The smile he put on was automatic, trained. "Of course," he said. "We pride ourselves on compliance." I believed he believed that. I opened the folder and let the silence stretch. Long enough to make people shift in their seats. Long enough for confidence to start leaking out. "Before we begin," I added, "I want to clarify that this is not an accusation meeting. It's a fact-finding discussion." That line matters. It makes people talk. The regional director nodded. HR dialed in remotely. Daniel relaxed just a fraction, so I started small. Routine questions, staffing policies, internal communication standards, how performance issues were documented. Daniel answered smoothly, hands folded, voice measured. He was good at this. He'd done it before, then I turned a single page. "On Tuesday," I said, "an internal email was distributed to branch staff regarding a termination." Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Yes," he said, "standard practice." "I'd like to read a sentence from that email," I continued. I didn't ask permission. "This reinforces our commitment to excellence." I looked up. "Can you explain how public internal commentary on individual performance aligns with Section 14.3 of the lease?" Silence. The regional director leaned forward. HR cleared her throat. Daniel frowned. "I'm not sure what you're referring to." I slid the printed lease excerpt across the table. Highlighted, annotated, clean. Section 14.3 requires management conduct that does not expose the property owner to reputational risk through documented internal communications that could be construed as defamatory or discriminatory, I said. Calm, neutral. This clause exists because the building's ownership shares reputational liability. That was the second crack. Daniel glanced at the paper, then at HR, then back at me. "This seems excessive," he said. It was an internal message. "That's often when liability begins," I replied. I didn't look at him when I said it. I looked at the regional director. She understood immediately. From there, the meeting shifted. Questions came faster, details mattered more. HR asked about tone. Facilities asked about precedent. Legal now looped in requested copies. Daniel spoke less. At one point, he laughed nervously. "This feels like a lot over one email." I met his eyes for the first time since sitting down. "It's never one email," I said. "It's patterns." That word hung in the air. Patterns, I could see him replaying moments, meetings, jokes, comments he'd never documented because he'd never imagined they'd matter. That's when I leaned back and let the final document slide forward. My name on the lease, not under the holding company, under the signature line. The room went still. Daniel stared at it, then at me, then back at the page as if it might rearrange itself. "Don't understand," he said quietly. I kept my voice even, almost kind. "You fired me," I said, "yesterday." And for the first time since I'd met him, Daniel had nothing to say. The confidence was gone, and the real meeting was about to begin. Daniel kept staring at the signature like it might blink first. The regional director was the one who broke the silence. She adjusted her glasses, leaned forward, and asked me a question that told me everything I needed to know. "You were employed." "Here," she said carefully. "Yes," I replied. "As a teller." Daniel's mouth opened, then closed. His face had gone pale in a way that makeup and good tailoring couldn't hide. For the first time, he wasn't performing. He was calculating and realizing he'd miscalculated badly. HR spoke next, her voice suddenly much more formal. "Just to confirm, your termination occurred yesterday." "That's correct," I said. "Effective immediately, publicly communicated." I didn't add anything else. I didn't need to. The regional director turned slowly toward Daniel. Not angrily, not dramatically, just disappointed. "Why wasn't this escalated?" she asked him. Daniel straightened in his chair. "I followed procedure," he said quickly. "Performance concerns, documented how," she interrupted. He hesitated, just a beat too long. I watched his hands. They were clenched now, knuckles white. HR asked for the file. Daniel said it would be forwarded. Legal asked for timestamps. Facilities asked about previous warnings tied to conduct. The questions weren't loud. They were precise, surgical. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, not because it hurt him, but because it exposed him. He had always relied on confidence and volume. Neither mattered here. I slid one last document forward. "This is a formal notice from the ownership group," I said. "Pending review, we're invoking the temporary oversight provision in the lease." The regional director's head snapped up. "Oversight?" "Yes," I said. "Which means leadership conduct is now subject to third-party review, effective immediately." Daniel turned to her. "You can't be serious." She didn't answer him right away. She looked at the paper, then at HR, then back at him. "We don't have a choice," she said finally. That was it. No shouting, no threats, just a quiet removal of certainty. The meeting ended shortly after. Action items were assigned, follow-ups scheduled. I gathered my folder, stood, and nodded politely to everyone at the table. As I reached the door, Daniel spoke. "Wait!" His voice cracked on the word. I turned. He stood halfway out of his chair now, uncertainty written across his face. "Why didn't you say something?" he asked. "When you worked here, if you had this kind of authority?" I studied him for a moment, really studied him. "Because it wouldn't have mattered," I said. "You don't listen to people you think are beneath you." That landed harder than anything else that day. I left the room and walked through the branch one last time, not as a teller, not as an owner, just as an observer. The same counters, the same printers, the same air. Except now people looked up. Over the next 2 weeks, the review did exactly what reviews always do when there's nothing shielding bad behavior anymore. Emails surfaced. Patterns emerged. Complaints that had been quietly buried were suddenly visible. Daniel was placed on leave. Then removed. Access revoked. Office emptied. Name scrubbed from the directory. No announcement, no apology, just absence. On my final day of involvement, I received one last update from legal. The lease remained unchanged. Compliance restored. Risk mitigated. I closed my laptop and sat in silence for a moment. Power doesn't look like shouting. It looks like patience. It looks like letting people reveal exactly who they are. And sometimes, it looks like a teller quietly walking out of a building she already owns, knowing the doors will never open the same way again. A month later, I walked past the building again. Not inside, just past it. Morning traffic hummed. People streamed through the revolving doors with coffee cups and phones pressed to their ears, unaware of how fragile the hierarchy inside really was. From the outside, nothing had changed. Same glass, same logo, same polished confidence. That's always how it looks. Inside, though, Daniel was already a cautionary tale. I heard things through quiet channels. How his name made people uncomfortable in meetings. How HR referenced a previous leadership failure without ever saying who. How the regional director had rewritten internal training around communication and power abuse. No one mentioned me, and that was exactly right. Revenge, the real kind, doesn't crave recognition. It doesn't need applause. It needs resolution. A former coworker messaged me one evening, just 2 lines. "He's gone for good." "Thank you." I didn't reply, not because I didn't care, but because I didn't want to rewrite the story into something emotional. This was never about humiliation. It was about balance. For years, I'd watched people like Daniel confuse authority with worth. They spoke louder to feel taller. They mistook silence for submission. They assumed the quiet ones had nowhere else to stand. What they never considered was that some people are quiet because they're choosing when to speak. I thought back to the moment he fired me, the way he smiled, the way he believed he was ending my story. In reality, he had just stepped into his own. I never went back to that branch. I didn't need to. The lease continued to generate returns. The building remained profitable. The system corrected itself once the distortion was removed. That's the thing about power structures. They don't collapse when challenged loudly. They collapse when they're examined closely. Sometimes people ask me why I didn't reveal myself sooner, why I let it go as far as it did. The answer is simple, because truth doesn't work when it's shouted at someone who isn't listening. It works when it's undeniable. Daniel didn't lose his job because I wanted revenge. He lost it because he built his authority on contempt, and contempt is always traceable once someone bothers to look. I learned something important from that chapter of my life. You don't need to intimidate to be powerful. You don't need to announce to be influential. And you don't need to win loudly for it to count. Sometimes the most effective move is letting someone believe they've won, right up until the moment the ground shifts under their feet. That building still stands. So the difference is I always knew who I was walking in as. He didn't. And that made all the difference. The truth is, that experience stayed with me longer than I expected. Not because of Daniel, but because of what it revealed about how power actually works when no one thinks they're being evaluated. Weeks after everything settled, I reviewed the original documents again. Not out of necessity, out of curiosity. I wanted to understand how close I'd come to intervening earlier and why I hadn't. I realized something uncomfortable. If I had revealed myself the first time he humiliated me, I would have won the moment but lost the lesson. Daniel would have blamed bad luck, a hidden connection, an unfair system. He would have learned nothing. And someone else somewhere else would have taken his place and done the same damage. But by letting him operate freely, confidently, without resistance, he documented himself. Every email, every comment, every small cruelty stacked neatly into a pattern he couldn't argue with. That's the danger of unchecked arrogance. It assumes no one important is watching. After that, I stopped thinking of myself as someone who had gotten revenge. That word feels too emotional, too loud. What I did was apply pressure at the correct structural point. No raised voice, no confrontation in the hallway, no dramatic reveal in front of staff, just process, just timing, just patience. I still work occasionally in environments where people underestimate me. Not because I need to, but because it reminds me how transparent people become when they think they're safe. They reveal how they treat those they believe can't respond. And I've learned that those moments are always more informative than resumes, titles, or credentials. Every now and then I hear about Daniel through distant professional circles. His career didn't end, but it stalled. Permanently. He's careful now, polite, quiet. Some people call that growth. I call it awareness arriving too late. If there's one thing I took away from that chapter, it's this. Power doesn't announce itself with confidence. It doesn't need to dominate conversations. It doesn't correct people in public. Real power waits. It listens. And when it moves, it does so in a way that leaves no room for argument. I was never angry when he fired me. I was curious. Curious to see how far someone would go when they believed they were untouchable. As it turns out, not very far at all. Because when the illusion of authority meets documented reality, only one of them survives. And it's never the illusion.